What is the current state of China's corporate governance? As we see from this first graphic, Chinese corporate governance ranks relatively badly vis-a-vis other jurisdictions. So looking at the corporate governance indicators, which amalgamate several different types of indicators, we see that China ranks lower than Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And interestingly enough, China could well learn from Hong Kong, as Hong Kong seems to represent the leader amongst regional economies in corporate governance. In this next infographic, we see that China's corporate governance only rates 37% vis-a-vis other jurisdictions. In this infographic, we break up these corporate governance scores into their components, and you can see the original paper for more definition on each of these components. The graphic shows the lowest score in each category, the average score, and the highest score in each category. In that way, we can look at the relative dispersion among Chinese companies in terms of each of these corporate governance dimensions. China's corporate governance in the area of fairness, transparency, surprisingly enough, and supervisors rate relatively high, particularly for those highest scoring companies. However, when we look at the corporate governance scores overall, we see that China's corporate governance across these dimensions comes in at a relatively low 37%. Not only are corporate governance scores relatively low in China, but we see that they're also out of control in the statistical sense of the word. As you recall from other infographic presentations, we describe a process as out of control when any indicator or score exhibits a high amount of variability. That variability prevents policymakers from adopting stable rules that can address those problems. Corporate governance scores for Chinese companies have varied significantly from 2008 to 2012. They also vary quite significantly between the lowest scoring companies and the highest scoring companies. However, these perspectives hide a relatively more complex phenomenon in the mainland's corporate governance. Namely, corporate governance practices affect large Chinese companies differently than small Chinese companies. In this infographic, we see the effect of corporate governance on the particular tax payment behavior of various Chinese companies. And we see that for large Chinese companies, better corporate governance scores tend to correlate with more tax cheating, implying that corporate governance actually helps these companies figure out ways of cheating on their taxes, whereas for small companies, good corporate governance practices encourage them to pay their taxes. So looking at the broader pattern, we see that the relationship between corporate governance and other behaviors like tax avoidance, they're nonlinear. They exhibit this kind of hill shape. We see that corporate governance rules can either serve the company that adopts them, or they can help serve the private interests of directors and managers who run those companies. Thus, looking at a mainland company and seeing that they rate highly in terms of corporate governance does not necessarily tell us whether their practices are investor-friendly or worker-friendly. Thus, from a policy perspective, the best amount of corporate governance reform is that reform which falls into the Goldilocks level, or a corporate governance reform that's neither too much so as to encourage self-seeking, but not too little such as to hinder a company's efforts at improving its behavior vis-a-vis other institutions, workers, and other stakeholders.